I wasted a couple of hours watching Eric Hoven's cinematic event, the movie Genesis Paradise Lost, Part 1. Yeah, there's going to be a second part coming. Anyway, here's their blurb for it, their own description of this movie. Cutting-edge cinematography meets proven science and biblical accuracy to deliver Genesis Paradise Lost, bringing the first book of the Bible to life in both 2D and 3D formats on the big screen. Stunning visual effects and field research invite audiences to explore the much-studied and debated opening chapters of the Bible. Unfortunately, every sentence, every phrase in that is a lie, except maybe the claim of biblical accuracy. It's true, this movie is about as accurate as the Bible, which means not at all. Let me first deal with one pretense. That this spectacular visual spectacle of top-notch special effects, it is not. I'd estimate that less than 20 minutes of this thing is taken up with computer graphics, and it's far from cutting edge. So, visualize a graphic cutscene from a late 1990s video game. That's what we get. It's slow, it's clumsy, it's unimpressive. Sure, there are animated dinosaurs, but they don't move very fast, and they look like they were made of plasticine. The creators also constantly fall back on a simple cheat. Blur out anything that might be unconvincing. So this is supposed to be a chimp. If you see this in a church basement sometime in the near future, you might be worried that there's something wrong with your eyes, but no, fear not. They're just cutting lots of corners on the rendering. So it's murky, it's brown, it's blurry. That's all because the entire movie looks that way. Murky, brown, and blurry is exactly how best to describe the graphical quality of this show. Another thing they like a lot, lens flare. Look at that. It adds verisimilitude, don't you know? This cheap rendering is particularly bad with their attempt at illustrating humans. So let's take a look at Adam. Here he is. He's a kind of beige doll lying down on beige dirt, but apparently their software isn't very good at handling objects interacting with each other. So he's not so much lying down on the ground as he is standing horizontally in close proximity to a flat surface, while holding his head and hand in an unnaturally awkward position that doesn't actually require them to conform to their environment. This is a department store mannequin that has fallen down. If Adam is bad, though, Eve is worse. We get a brief shot of Eve in profile. She looks a little bit Taylor Swiftish, and then immediately, just as you might be anticipating a glimpse of Taylor Swift's bouncing boobs and jiggling buttocks, the virtual camera goes flying back 500 yards and totally out of focus, so all you can see is a blurry sort of bipedal smudge. See this stock photo of a blurry naked woman? There's far more detail in that than the animated Eve in this movie. I guess they were afraid that their Christian audience would assault the movie screen if there was even a hint of hoo-ha anywhere in it. So, if all the graphics constitutes 20 minutes of content, you might be asking, what about the remaining hour and 20 minutes? And that's easy. It's all preaching. Let me tell you, if the graphics are straight off of a CD of 1990s computer games, the content is old-school 1970s style obnoxious campus preacher haranguing sinful students down at the quad. I tried taking notes, but it was impossible there in the dark, and because it was a genuine grand gish gallop throughout. The photography style doesn't help either. Like I said, it's all going to be murky and brown. Here's the cast. You will not be surprised if I tell you that these photos are reflective of the video style of the interviews. They're dark, they're sort of sepia-toned, with generally gloomy backgrounds. It had to be intentional because they're all shot that way. Furthermore, you can also tell how it was shot. The crew went to each of these people one at a time and in a single long session with unchanging backgrounds had them ad-lib railing against evolutionists. And then they split up each interview into short snippets and spliced them together in whatever the hell order they felt like. It feels incredibly lazy. And this is the bulk of the movie. A train of short clips of wacko creationists spluttering out nonsense and lies. So what I'm going to do is try and take apart the first few minutes of this horror show. There's a 7-minute Gish Gallop at the beginning, and it's actually a good overview of the whole movie. So I'll just dig into that for a bit. Forget the cheesy CGI. I'm not going to show you much of that. What we really get mostly, that's most representative of the content of the movie, is 7 interminable minutes of fast cuts of creationists spitting out one-liners. So first we're going to discuss the nature of reality.
The Bible begins with a statement that is so simple a child can understand it, yet so inexhaustibly profound. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. You see, this argument over God's existence, or creation versus evolution, is not so much a religious argument, rather it is an ontological argument. That is, an argument concerning the nature of reality.
It's not science versus religion, it's a worldview clash.
Two different views of origins, resulting in two totally different worldviews that clash.
People are battling over two different histories. You either trust God or you trust man.
It really becomes an issue of authority. Who is the authority? Is it God and his word, or is it man?
Okay, that guy at the beginning is Jeremy Lyon, a theologian I've never heard of before. And we only hear from him a few times in the movie, probably because he sounds incredibly pompous. I'm sorry, but saying in the beginning God created is not a particularly profound statement. And also, redefining it as an ontological argument, yeah, I'm sure the bulk of the audience understood what he's talking about there. And I'm sorry, but the claim that this isn't about science versus religion is nonsense. It most certainly is. Only a narrow sect of religious people argue that the Earth is young, while the evidence says rather clearly that the Earth is over 4 billion years old. And they're just in denial. It's an interestingly incoherent argument, though. On the one hand, they're going to try and argue that creationism is scientific, and this is just a difference in interpretation, and a worldview clash. On the other hand, they're also going to claim that all of science is wrong, and that they alone are objectively correct. It makes no sense to simultaneously argue that it's simply a difference in interpretation of opinion, and at the same time claim that all the facts are on their side. You can't declare that this is simply a difference of opinion while actively denying virtually all the evidence to come to a counterfactual conclusion. This is a game to them. Reduce all knowledge to opinion, and then you can pick and choose what things to believe, and argue that all disagreement is simply bias, and that you were correct all along. They also rely on that old standby of the creationist movement, the false dichotomy. So we're going to listen to Danny Faulkner. Here's Danny. And he's going to explain to us something incredibly foolish.
Really, we only have two possibilities. Either the universe and we came about through a purely natural, purely physical process. We just happened. Or somebody made us.
Okay, so somebody made us. Or nobody made us. Those are our choices. Sure. But from their side of the argument, who made us? Jehovah? Allah? Brahma? Little green men from Beetlejuice? You don't just have to claim that it's either Jesus or nobody. On the other side, what does it mean to say we just happened? There are many details to be argued over here. If you talk to most scientists, they'll tell you it wasn't pure chance, although chance plays a significant part, but that life arose as a natural consequence of necessary outcomes of chemistry. It's disingenuous to announce that the only choices are to accept that I am right or no one is right. He also doesn't consider probabilities. You can invent any absurd outcome you want, contrast it to a more mainstream view, and then demand that the listener pick. But they're not equal choices. They're not equivalent. You have to balance the evidence for what you're going to select. But this is another common creationist game. Reduce complexity to only two possibilities among many. Make sure their preferred option is one of the two, and mischaracterize the other alternative. It's dishonest and stupid. What if I announce that there are only two possibilities? Either Mormonism is true, or Scientology is. They can't both be correct, so you have to choose. You have to choose one now, right now. And disregard the evidence. You've just got to make the choice between those two. This leads into another common aspect of this strategy, though. If we accept that there are just two choices, then we just have to characterize the choice we don't like as terrible. So if we accept the evolution side of the dichotomy, then there's a consequence. You are worthless and hopeless and meaningless and purposeless.
I was really taught that there was a Big Bang. There was millions of years. Man slowly evolved.
Evolution, atheistic evolution, Big Bang, millions of years.
If we simply happen, then there really is no right or wrong. We could really live our lives the way we wish to, and that's a huge consequence.
Evolution has a lot of unintended consequences that I'm not sure everyone's thought about. They relate to ethics. They relate to whether or not the world's supposed to be good. And when you find yourself struggling with evil, you got to ask yourself, well, I thought the world was supposed to be this way. If evolution's true, then get used to it.
You see, if evolution is true, who am I? Well, you're nothing important. You're just a piece of protoplasm that washed up from the cosmic shores.
I mean, man's just an animal. We're Mother Nature's science project.
Why am I here? Well, if evolution is true, if nature's all there is, well, there's no real purpose. You might as well do whatever you feel like. If it feels good, do it.
You have no meaning. There's no reason for you to exist.
Where am I going when I die? We're going to go back into the ground, and that's going to be it. The lights are turned out.
You die and become part of nothingness. You're worthless.
Wow. Are you depressed now? I'm not, but okay. You may have noticed early on in that clip there was Ken Ham, and I'm going to quote him in full. His entire sentence was, evolution, atheistic evolution, Big Bang, millions of years. Period. That was it. Where is the verb? All the AIG bots have to do is recite their mantra, millions of years, and they think they've made a point. Now, also, another thing they said, someone in that mess claimed that there are a lot of unintended consequences that no one has thought about. Maybe they ought to look into this ancient and arcane discipline called philosophy. It seems to me that there have been a lot of people thinking for a very long time about precisely these questions, and they aren't all Christians. Some are atheists, some accept other religious beliefs. But one thing you cannot claim is that no one has been thinking about the consequences of our beliefs or the nature of our existence. The only people who haven't seem to be religious dogmatists. I think we all find our own purpose. Some people seem to find comfort in the idea of joining a celestial choir after they're dead, so they can sing the praises of an all-powerful cosmic boss for eternity. I don't find that idea at all appealing. So if we're going to choose what is true by what we'd like to be true, then I'd rather go back into the ground when I die and become part of nothingness than to become an immortal slave in the service of an omnipotent tyrant. The argument from consequences is not a valid method for determining the truth of a claim. Part of the nature of human life is that we grow old and die. An unpleasant fate is inevitable for all of us. You can't use that to argue that therefore, because human existence sucks, humans don't exist. Likewise, you can't use the brutal, vicious myth of hell to argue that Christianity is false, because there are ugly consequences embedded in the faith. It's also not evidence for Christianity that there is a claimed existence of a desirable consequence, heaven. But too often these guys think discussing the desirability of an imaginary fate, that you will live forever in paradise, is a good enough reason to believe. Now, I'm going to give you a little warning here for this next clip. It's going to abruptly switch from talking about God's beneficence to a bunch of irate people upset at the idea that holding some beliefs is incompatible with rationality. Don't blame me. I'm playing the whole of a 7-minute overview of themes from the movie exactly as presented in the movie itself. So any incoherence is entirely their fault.
But if there is a God, in particular the God of the Bible, then the world or reality is altogether different.
I thought to believe in the Bible meant you had to reject science. I thought I had to take like a mental lobotomy in order to start believing the Bible.
We hear the mantra, all the scientists believe in evolution.
Some people today want to insist that you can't do science without believing in evolution.
In other words, if you're a creationist, you're not classed as a scientist.
There are thousands of PhD scientists all over the world who don't accept evolution, and many of them don't accept the millions of years.
Sorry, guy. You do need a mental lobotomy to believe in a narrowly literal interpretation of the Bible. You have to reject science, the body of observation, and their interpretation in the greater context of tested theory to believe in creationism. All the credible scientists who study the history of life on Earth accept evolution. Not all scientists study that topic. And all the credible scientists with knowledge of the evidence accept that the Earth is billions of years old. Yes, you can find crackpots with PhDs, maybe even thousands of them, who reject the facts. But the existence of fringe wackaloons, some of whom are starring in this movie, does not mean that we should believe their weird ideas. Speaking of crackpots with PhDs, though, this one guy, Charles Jackson, gave me a good laugh. That's not a flattering picture. Throughout this movie, I was actually kind of repelled by his appearance because honestly, it looks like he never brushes his teeth, as they're always kind of yellowish. But I'm confident that the problem there is the incompetent film crew and the horrible lighting used in the movie, not Jackson's dental hygiene, which is probably just fine. But he does say something really, really stupid.
I do have 4 degrees. Most evolutionists I've met have only 3. There is a small movement in the evolutionist community to try to get the doctoral degrees rescinded from all professing creationists. That's never going to happen, but the fact that someone's trying speaks of the nature of the debate.
Good God, he has 4 degrees, while most evolutionists only have 3. I guess that makes him smarter than all the evolutionists. No, that's nuts. This isn't a contest to see who has the most degrees. I only have 2, a Bachelor of Science in Zoology and a doctorate in biology. But no one in their right mind cares. All that matters is the final degree. Jackson's degrees, by the way, are a BS in biology, an MS in science education, an MS in environmental biology, and an EDD in science ed. His degrees would be considered inadequate for my position as a professor of biology at a small liberal arts college, no matter that he has twice as many diplomas as I do. And apparently even Liberty University thinks the same, because he's an adjunct professor of religion there, not biology. I also don't know of any movement to rescind degrees from creationists, not even a small one. His existing degrees do not qualify him as an authority on evolutionary biology. So I can't even imagine trying to claim that his incompetence in evolutionary biology has any bearing on his doctorate in education. Okay, but this imaginary persecution fits with their other paranoid delusions. So here comes a fun little section.
secularists, the atheists, they took control of science. They took control of all the science journals, all the university science programs.
They've taken over the museums, they've taken over the state schools, they've taken over the universities.
The textbooks, the public schools in every country.
The secularists really have control of the education system, and they want their religion of secularism, of atheism, of naturalism forced upon the students.
They use political pressure, they use scare tactics, they use the ACLU, they will intimidate school districts and take away their autonomy that is given to them by the Constitution. And if that's what they have to do, if you need laws to protect your scientific theory from criticism, what does that tell you about your theory?
In America, there is no separation of church and state because the state is forcing a religion on generations of kids, and that is that everything can be explained by natural processes only. They eliminate the supernatural. That is a religion. It's a religion of atheism.
Yeah, okay. Well, all I got to say is, if your churches require walls and a roof to protect them from the weather, what does that tell you about their God? Okay, there's a reason evidence-based rational ideas dominate the school systems. They should, because the criterion for acceptance is there's objective evidence for the claims, that we have a body of observation and experiment that supports what we teach, like the theory of evolution. Creationism lacks that. Whining that empiricism is a religion is not a way to persuade anyone that religious bullshit should therefore be taught in the schools. And atheists did not take over science and education. I gotta admit, I kind of wish they would, but no, it's not going to happen. Not all scientists are atheists. Most teachers are not atheists. The reason science took over as an authoritative source of useful information is because it works and is confirmable. Nothing more. That you can hold the ideas of science while also going to church every Sunday. These people are just unhappy because their beliefs are unable to win over people who have a higher standard for acceptance than that there are words in a holy book that says it is so. But then the next step from arguing that science cheated to get undeserved preeminence is to claim that religion used to be in charge of science back in the bad old days. So they make an oddly ahistorical historical argument.
They hijack science and they convince the whole world that science is only possible within an atheistic worldview, even though modern science was born in the womb of the Christian worldview.
Do you know that science was pretty much invented by people of faith? Think of Isaac Newton. I think he needs a better PR agent. All we know is that he had an apple fall on his head and discovered gravity. He was always trying to do mathematical formulas and show that the idea of math and reason came directly from a creator who invented the world.
Isaac Newton, Boyle, Pasteur, Faraday, these guys were Bible-believing Christians.
John Kepler, who really pretty much invented modern astronomy. He didn't see a problem between science and the scriptures.
Most of the early scientists were not materialists. Most of the early scientists were theists, believed that there was a God who had created everything, and the reason that we could understand the created world was that there was a mind, an intelligence behind the material world.
We need to acknowledge there's a creator God who put in place an orderly universe to allow us to understand science.
What makes more sense? A rational God who created a rational world that can be studied rationally, or an irrational, meaningless process created a rational world that can be studied rationally?
I have to admit it's true. When evolution was not known, people were not evolutionists. The early scientists didn't see a conflict with religion because they didn't have access to the information that revealed a serious conflict between the observable evidence about the natural world and the claims in their holy book. It's not surprising that a 17th century scientist like Kepler knew nothing of a 19th century theory and the evidence supporting it, and didn't see a conflict with creationism. It's also always weird to see these guys claim that science is Christian, yet ignore Jewish and Islamic scholarship, or the work of scientists and engineers in India and China, or the numerous atheist scientists in the modern era. By the way, Bodhi Hodge, who was speaking there, is the babbling idiot in there who thinks that all we know of Newton is that an apple fell on his head. He's an embarrassment. There's a tremendous amount of scholarship in Newton, and the whole falling apple story is nonsense. But speaking of Hodge, here he comes again with his sole narrow criterion of observable and repeatable to claim that evolution, the Big Bang, millions of years, origin of life, are not scientific.
In a secularized world, where there's no right and wrong, everything just exploded and this is what we have, why would we have all these beautiful laws like F equals MA or E equals MC squared? In a secular worldview with things like Big Bang, evolution, millions of years, origin of life, those are not scientific. A lot of people have been duped into believing that they are, but they're not. For example, is Big Bang observable and repeatable? No. Is millions of years observable and repeatable? No. Origin of life, has anybody ever made life from non-life? No.
Evolution is not scientific fact. The millions of years is not scientific fact. Evolution and millions of years is the greatest myth ever forced on the minds of men. The reason that everybody believes it is because they've been brainwashed.
Are we going to believe man who wasn't there during the supposed millions and millions of years of our history and who really just has to make up stories about what happened in the past?
When you start buying into evolution, millions of years, and some of those ideas, as soon as you've done that, you've opened the door to say you don't have to trust the Bible completely.
All right. By observable and repeatable, can we also disqualify the biblical account of creation? Have you ever seen a God create life? Can you repeat it? Why should I believe an interpretation of a holy book by people who also ignore physical evidence? Were they there? But this is another common theme out of AIG. They repeat this all over the place. They redefine science to exclude most science and then claim that they've got the correct answer. So here's Terry Mortensen, one of the cast of this movie. In this case, he's lecturing on what science is, as if he'd know. So he says it's got to be observable and repeatable. That's a fine idea. Did you know that we have observed fossils of pterosaurs repeatedly? Or that radiometric dating has undergone extensive testing and evaluation? Paleontologists are also firm believers in observation and collecting data, yet AIG rejects their work. Experiments in a controlled environment. Well, hey, let's toss out an awful lot of field work. You can't ever control for all variables in a system, even in a lab, but some are easier than others. This is a nonsensical requirement. It rules out a lot of clinical research. It rules out field work. It means arbitrarily that if it doesn't fit in a lab, you can't study it. Patterns of recurring behavior. Okay. We know how radioactive elements behave, for instance. We know rates of decay. We know how particles interact. We know what happens when radioactive elements are isolated. So why doesn't Mortensen accept radiometric dating? It is the product of repeated observations of recurring behavior in a controlled environment. It's science. And for that matter, what's wrong with studying unique events? The extinction of the dinosaurs at the KT boundary was a single dramatic event, as was the Great Flood, if you believe it, as Mortensen does. Does that mean that AIG refuses to treat Noah's flood as a scientifically confirmable event? Because they do. Their website is full of crap where they announce that the flood actually happened and they have the scientific proof. They've built its giant ark park as a testimony to the scientific reality of the Great Flood. But in the present, it has to be in the present. That's kind of arbitrary. Except, wait, the flood was 3,500 years ago, they say. So we can't scientifically study it? But they do. So we can't scientifically study the eruption of Mount St. Helens because it happened 37 years ago? We can only study it as it was happening? This is simply flagrant bullshit, totally wrong, incorrect, invalid, and not the way that science is done. But AIG has been promoting this gaming of our understanding of science for years. This is another AIG sort of argument that these things are not testable. But the age of the Earth, for instance, those millions of years, has been determined by observable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable observations and experiments. Millions of years fulfills even their narrow definition of science, except that the arbitrary conclusion that you can't study anything in the past. Yet they reject it. Dishonest hypocrite ought to be tattooed on Ken Ham's forehead. Why do they continue to promote these lies? It's easy. They give away the whole store in the next segment. So, what Hodge says, Bodhi Hodge here says, is that accepting evolution opens the door to you don't have to trust the Bible completely.
If you can't believe Genesis 1 through 12, why should you believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? That's just a logical incoherence. Now you're picking and choosing which scriptures to believe. Hypocrisy in the church is the greatest deterrent to turning people to Christ and to confidence in the written word from Genesis to Revelation.
Genesis is so important because it's the foundation of who God is, who we are. Why is the world broken? Why do bad things happen to good people? And why do good things sometimes happen to bad people? And does anyone have a fix? All this gets related to us in Genesis.
Genesis is giving us the true history of the world. The scientific evidence does not support evolution in millions of years. It confirms what Genesis says about a flood, about the age of the earth.
God's word is true from the very first birth. And we need to, in this debate of creation and evolution, always be standing on the truth of God's word.
Stand firm on the authority of the Word of God, starting with the very first verse.
If you can't believe Genesis 1 through 12, why should you believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? I could not have said it better myself. If Genesis 1 through 12 is demonstrably false as a scientific fact, obviously we cannot disprove it as a literary metaphor, then sure, I'm happy to encourage you to think that the whole Bible crumbles away into garbage. If Jackson is sincerely concerned about coherence, then he ought to be thinking the same way. But look, I'm an atheist, I admit it, and this stuff plays directly into my hands. If your religion demands that every statement in your holy book must be absolutely, inarguably true, and that your entire faith hinges on a complete lack of metaphor, poetry, allusion, and analogy in that book, that it is as dry and literal and factual as a table of measures in an engineering text, then I've got you. I'm going to win over your children to my side, and you know it. As an atheist, I'm often told that I don't understand religion, but I do. I understand it better than the fanatical literalists, anyway. Religion has a long history of struggling to reconcile reality and belief, to find humanity's place in a largely unknown and complex and frequently hostile universe. If there is any saving grace in faith at all, it is an attempt to find a rock of certainty in the unpredictable chaos of life. It is aspirational, a search for truth. As such, religion changes over time. It evolves. Where it fails is when people like Ham and the Hovens give up on the search and the struggle and decide that they have an absolute lock on an irrevocable and ultimate truth, one that will no longer bend to the evidence, that will no longer care about the nature of reality, but only the nature of one antique interpretation of the words of a book. They will not change anymore. They will cling stubbornly to this one unmoving stone of dogma, and they will insist that everything else is wrong. They will close their eyes and grasp tighter and tighter that one illusion of certainty as it crumbles around them. By refusing to bend, they commit themselves to someday breaking. The movie goes on like this for another hour and a half. More tiresome and tired old creationist arguments, interspersed with brief episodes of bad CGI, accompanied by this slow, lugubrious voice of a god. It ends with another 10 or 15 minutes of fast cuts between their cast members, all testifying and preachifying about the glory of God and how lovely Jesus makes them feel. It just makes me terribly sad. These are lost minds committed to battling against the real world.